Let's see if that works. And in a moment, I'll see a live stream. Yep, we are live. So welcome everyone to Climate Chat. I am your host, Dan Miller. And Happy New Year to everyone. Today is December 31st. It's New Year's Eve day. And we're going to be taking a look both sort of back in 2023 and looking to 2024 with the general theme of talking about, will there be action, serious action on climate change beginning next year? And we'll talk about what that means and what it could look like and things like that. And also some of the reasons why it hasn't been happening up until now. And two sort of contrasting stories that we'll focus on. One is a Guardian article titled, "World Will Look Back at 2023 as Year Humanity Exposed Its Inability to Tackle Climate Crisis, Scientists Say." That's a very long title. And then so that's sort of on the negative side. And then on the more optimistic side is a New York Times Magazine article, from today, New York Times Magazine. "What if people don't need to care about climate change to fix it?" And that's from Hannah Ritchie, who gave a TED Talk on that subject. So that's sort of the framing for today. And again, today is an open discussion, which means you are welcome to join on Zoom. If you're watching on YouTube Live and want to join on Zoom, you first need to go to Clubhouse and go to Clubhouse and go to Climate Chat House, and find the room. And the pinned at the top room is the Zoom link. Or alternatively, you could DM me on Twitter, which I'll try to check once in a while, at DanMiller999 on Twitter, and ask for the Zoom link. And you could also, not sure if you can do it on YouTube Live in the comments section. I don't think that will work. So anyway, that's where you can join the discussion. And talking a little bit about upcoming rooms next week. Very exciting room with Peter Didlevitsen, who's one of the co-authors of the paper on the AMOC collapse, which we have talked about many times on Climate Chat. A brief summary of that paper is that while the IPCC thinks the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, you can think of it as the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is part of it, but it's not the Gulf Stream. But it's the currents that take warm water from the tropics up to Northern Europe. That's been slowing down for a while. And the IPCC said, don't worry, it's not going to shut down for like a century. A very low probability event. And with this paper we'll be discussing next week, says that actually it's a lot more likely that the AMOC will shut down quite soon, and that's a big deal. It's something that everyone in the world should be thinking about, talking about, worrying about, and no one is. And so we'll be talking with the author. Now, there's been pushback on the article, as scientists say, well, it's we still don't think it's going to happen soon, or something like that. So it'll be a very, very interesting discussion. And then that's on January 7th. And on January 14th, we have Dr. Johanna Volhard, who we met about talking while covering and no one is. So sorry, I'm getting feedback. This is off. Okay. I don't know where that came from. Oh, maybe it's somebody on the stage here. Okay. Oh yeah, okay, let's hold on. Okay, how do I mute that? Okay. Sorry about that. And then Dr. Volhard we met on the climate march in New York when we were covering that live. And she's an expert on how protests can be effective or not effective. And we're going to be talking to her about climate protesting in general and well, protesting in general and how, what kind of things are effective in the protests and activism, and also specifically when it comes to climate change. So that'll be on the 14th. And then we have some other folks lined up coming up, like Ben C. If you follow on Twitter, he's very, very active on climate. We had a little discussion on Twitter yesterday and then invited him to come on. He basically, well, I don't want to get too much into that, but he takes a rather radical view, which, maybe it's not really that radical, that we have to change the economic system in order to fight climate change. We have to have degrowth, and that's kind of a phrase that bantered about in these discussions. So we'll talk about degrowth when we schedule him, might be later in January, and a lot of other opportunities. And if you have suggestions on people we should interview, then please email me at climatechatclub@gmail.com, climatechatclub@gmail.com, or DM me at Twitter at DanMiller999. So with all that out of the way, welcome. Oh, I forgot to say, subscribe and like the video so we can spread it around. Yes, welcome, Stacy.
Sorry, Dan. I just wanted to say good morning because you may have wished me a good morning. I'm not sure. But I hit the YouTube and the Zoom at the same time and then couldn't get Windows closed fast enough and didn't want the competing audio.
Yeah, that's what I heard for a short time there. Okay.
So it's just mute, 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 mute. And anyway, good morning.
Good morning. And actually, I'm hearing you without an echo, and I don't know why, because last week I had the echo, so I'm not sure. Might be I'm using different headphones, so that might
was it an echo just for you or for everyone?
It was me, but it was no problem when I turned down the volume when I'm talking. But then when someone else talked, I had to turn up the volume and stop talking myself. But right now it's
okay.
It's all working. I don't know. I'm using these headsets, and so maybe this is helping. Maybe the other ones I were using was part of the problem. I don't know.
Yeah, I think sometimes if there's a noise cancellation feature that it either helps or hurts. I don't know which way it is, but I know that some headphones are susceptible to that.
So let's jump in here. Let's see which is the right one. Let's jump in on the Guardian. How do I get rid of this ad? There we go. Try to do, well, it really wants to be an ad there. Okay, let me get to Zoom and to share screen. Go to here. And Stacy, are you seeing that the Guardian article on the screen now?
I sure am. I'm also seeing yeah, that's better. Keep
yeah,
scrolling.
an ad
there
that
you
I
go.
couldn't get rid of. Well, they got to make some money. That's good. So the Guardian had a story actually interviewing Jim Hansen. And as most of you know, we interviewed Jim a couple of weeks ago, and basically, saying a lot of these things that are in this article. But world will look back at 2023 as year humanity exposed its inability to tackle climate crisis, scientists say. And it talks about how the hottest year in recorded history is this year. It talks a lot about the temperatures, hottest July in 120,000 years. And talked about Jim Hansen testifying to Congress, 1988, one of the first high-profile revelations about global heating. By the way, Carl Sagan testified to Congress a couple of years before that, and which is also an interesting thing. And it has there's a picture of Jim. That's nice. And then it's just talking about the difference between what science demands and what politics is delivering. And it talks about the COP28 summit in Dubai and how that really wasn't very effective. It was run by a fossil fuel executive, and it sort of lost its credibility. Although I read that it had far, like I went to the COP15 in Copenhagen, and that had a lot of people. I think it was like 20,000. Dubai had like 100,000 people. course, half of them were fossil fuel lobbyists, I guess. But anyway, so then it goes on to talk about how there's a 99% chance that 2023 is going to be the hottest year. That's certainly true now. It's only been warming towards the end of the year, and now they do think it might be, it's also fueled by El Nino, which makes it a little bit warmer. But I should say, by the way, one of the important points that Jim Hansen made, both in his paper and when we were talking, is that right now it's about 1.5 degrees, plus or minus a little bit. And people are saying, well, when you hit 1.5 peak, that's not really the same as hitting 1.5 trend or average, and so average means that sometimes it's above 1.5 and sometimes it's below, and then, but the kind of average temperature over a series of years is 1.5. Well, what Hansen is saying is that, well, next year we'll probably be at 1.6 or maybe 1.7 degrees of warming. And then when it cools off, but that's with an El Nino, and everything, wow, that's with an El Nino, so that makes it warmer than average, so that doesn't really count. So yeah, but that's above 1.5. When it cools off, it only cools off like by 0.2 degrees. And so that will bring you down to 1.4, let's say it's 1.6, cools down 0.2, you'll be at 1.4. Well, if you're above it when it's warm and you're below it when you get a cooling La Nina, well, that kind of means that you're at 1.5 average. Now, he's not saying that is already true. He says it will be true if we actually do hit 1.6 or 1.7, which he thinks we will. And the data so far says that we will. So that's kind of mind-blowing, by the way. And a lot of the scientific community hasn't accepted that yet. In fact, Michael Mann, I can't even explain this. I have no idea how he could say this, but says if we get to net zero by 2050, we could stay under 1.5. And that just blows my mind that someone like him can say that. But it is what it is, I guess. So as Hansen points out, well, he can say what he wants, but we'll find out next May when it's 1.6 degrees, whether he was right, the man was right, or Hansen was right. So we'll find out that pretty soon. So this article goes on to talk about, what it could mean if the temperatures stay that high, and what's happening in the Antarctic, how it's kind of amazing. It rained in the wintertime in this place in Antarctica, which you never, ever would see rain. And, so things are changing there. Record low Antarctic sea ice, very high rain disaster. The Libyan flood killed 11,000 people. And in a single day, it unleashed 200 times as much rain as usually falls in an entire month of September. And climate change made this 50 times more likely. So talked about Maui. So it talks about these disasters of what's happening, and saying that we're really not doing anything. So I'm framing this one first, and then we'll talk about this very optimistic New York Times. But if people have comments, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody here. If anyone has comments, you can raise your hand, and I'll ask you to unmute so you can talk, and you can turn on your video as well. And if you don't have it, Stacy, any comments or thoughts yourself? Okay, no. Okay. By the way, I don't expect lots of people today because it is New Year's, and that's also why we're doing a discussion show. And by the way, let me also do a quick check. Okay, I'm looking just for comments. Ariane. By the way, you guys in Clubhouse, if you want to come on over and join the discussion, please do. Okay. So the next story, let me pull that one up. And we'll get back to Zoom here and share the screen. And this is from the New York Times Magazine. And you got to remember that because it makes it very hard you can't search for it on NewYorkTimes.com, which I tried to do. So someone sent me this link. And so it's New York Times Magazine, which seems to be separate from the archives of the New York Times. So keep that in mind. And this is an interview with Hannah Ritchie. So Hannah is a scientist, a senior researcher in the program on global development at the University of Oxford, and deputy editor of the online publication Our World in Data, and is the author of the upcoming book, Not the End of the World. And in it, she argues that as it says here, I'll just read this first thing here. In it, she argues that the flood of doom-laden stats and stories about climate change is obscuring our ability to imagine solutions to the crisis and envision a sustainable, livable future. That brighter story is one Ritchie, who is 30, builds by pointing to the progress being made in areas like deforestation, air cleanliness, and the falling cost and rising adoption of clean energy technologies. For a long time, quote, for a long time I felt helplessness, that these problems were massive and unsolvable, Ritchie says. It's important to counter those feelings. We need to go much faster, but there is a lot of progress to acknowledge and lessons to learn. And then they go on to interview her. And she basically is saying, first of all, she says she doesn't want to be political. She doesn't get into the policy realm. She thinks that scientists like her should just present the data and what the impacts of climate change will be if we don't address it and things like that. I'm not sure I agree with her on that, but that's what she's saying. And she's also then emphasizes the positive things, the falling price of renewable energy, for example, and the fact that it's cheaper than fossil fuels, and how President Trump at the time wanted to push coal. We're going to have more coal, and it just didn't happen because it was not economic anymore. And so she's trying to make the point that these things are good signs, and they are good signs, but at the same time, we're not actually taking on the battle. And I say, I'm very optimistic that we can address climate change. I'm not optimistic that we will. There's a difference. So, as somebody we interviewed on the show said, climate scientist Kevin Anderson, we are choosing to fail. It's a choice we're making. I mean, I disagree with the doomers that say it's too late. There's nothing we can do. There's a lot of them around. I don't think they're very helpful. There is a lot we can do, and we can actually address climate change if we choose to. But so far, we've chosen not to. And one of the reasons, actually, that I just watched another interview with Kevin Anderson, and he emphasized the fact that the reason we're not addressing climate change is that the people in charge of addressing climate change are the wealthy people who don't want to change their lifestyle. They have a good thing going. They can't imagine, not cutting back on air travel or any of the things that they do. And their emissions are much, much, much higher than everyone else. And so we have a system set up that's not designed to succeed. Obviously, the COP system isn't designed to succeed because it requires everyone, all the countries, to agree on something, and Saudi Arabia and Russia are not going to agree on cutting back fossil fuels, as we saw, because that was one of the main contention points at COP28, was whether the language would say we need to phase out fossil fuels, and instead it said we need to phase out unabated fossil fuels, which means that they're going to talk about carbon capture and use it as an excuse for continuing emissions. So anyway, that's going on there. And let's see, I will ask Eric to unmute and ask you to start your video. So let's see. I will stop sharing. Go ahead. I can't hear you.
I think
though.
she could be an
there you go.
interesting person. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I think she could be an interesting person to have maybe on the week that her book actually comes out. I think that it is an accomplishment that as far as I know, the publication Our World in Data is kind of a source used right, left, and center.
Oh, no, it's
So
great. Yeah.
obviously, I mean, her orientation as someone who's nurses a resource like that, I don't know the idea that scientists in general should be apolitical. It doesn't make any sense at all. But the idea that there's room in the world for something like Our World in Data. So maybe a conversation with her and you or someone who feels very differently on the week her book comes out could be exciting. It's just a thought. Thanks.
Right. I won't give her quite as much of a softball interview as the New York Times did. I mean, they did ask her some.
Obviously.
No, well, they did ask some decent questions, by the way. I should be a little careful about that. They didn't like, but what happens, what's different about something like that and what happens on our program is they ask the question, they maybe even ask a pretty, detailed or biting question, and then they just let her answer, and then they go into the next question, rather than having a back and forth and really exploring the issue. So I think that's what would be helpful here. I think when her book comes out, she'll probably be a little too busy to be on our program, but I could certainly reach out and ask her and see what we can do, because that would be a very interesting discussion. So,
I personally,
Oh.
I would love that because I use Our World in Data a lot. So it's hard to hear someone who I know knows the data intimately to come out on the sunny side of things.
Okay.
That's all.
Hey, Bev. Can you, do you have I think you're unmuted. I'm not sure. Do you have something you want to comment on? Oh, now you're connecting to audio. You didn't connect for some reason. I don't know what happened there. Okay. Well, let's see. If you want to try again, I'm looking, nothing here on my end I can do to help you there. Do you want to try again? See if something happened there? Unmute, see what happens. Not hearing anything. Yeah, you can text it over. We have a room chat here if you want to text a question, or you can disconnect and come back in. I think that's the other thing. Okay. Sorry, don't know what happened there. I'm gonna turn off the video there until you get that fixed. Okay, so that gives the two sides of the issue. One, we're hurtling down this path to destruction and doing nothing to really slow it down. And on the other side, there's a lot of things to be optimistic about. I actually agree with both. And I think the emphasis she makes on renewable energy is all true. I mean, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel energy in most cases, especially for electricity generation. There's a few cases like very high heat applications like cement and steel where it's not competitive yet, but a lot of work going on that, a lot of things you could do to reduce the emissions from those things if we chose to do it. And so the good news is renewable is cheap and it's growing extremely rapidly. But the problem is that even though it's growing rapidly, we're not reducing fossil fuel emissions. And the only thing that matters are the fossil fuel emissions. It doesn't matter how much renewable energy we have. I mean, it matters from a lifestyle point of view. The more energy, especially cheap energy that we have, the more stuff we can do with it. But when it comes to climate change doesn't see how much renewable energy we have. It doesn't see it because renewables don't contribute to climate change, which is the good news, but they also don't stop climate change. They're neutral, which is why we like them. But fossil fuel burning does contribute to climate change. It's the main culprit. It's like 75% of global warming comes from fossil fuel burning. The other 25% comes from land use changes like deforestation and methane from cows and things like that. So, so it's the fossil fuels that we should focus on. And while we focus on the renewable energy zooming up, which is great, but that doesn't matter. If you take a look at the fossil fuels, you'll see that they're fairly steady or going up a little bit. And they need to be dropping dramatically right now. That's what we need them to do. And they're not. And the reason they're not is because of like what happened at COP. The fossil fuel industry controls that setting. They have, they get trillions of dollars in subsidies from governments every year. They have lots of money to spend on lobbying and politics and things, and it's very effective. And they don't really have any intention of lowering their emissions for the next little while. And so that's the situation we're in. However, at any time that we decide that we don't want to follow this disastrous path, we can decide not to. And instead of choosing to fail, we can choose to succeed. And you might ask, well, what does that look like? So I'm going to pop up, let's see, go to screen share again and go. And this is, I think you should be able to see that. Yeah. This is something I drafted a while ago. This is the fourth version of it. And it's sort of the plan for when you're actually interested in succeeding. What does a plan based on succeeding to fight climate change look like? Excuse me. And the main part of the plan is to phase out fossil fuels. It's kind of obvious, by the way. I put this together, and I certainly don't consider it to be some incredible work of academia or something like that no one else could ever come up with. I mean, if you sit down and think about the problem is we're burning too many fossil fuels. We have to get rid of them. What would your plan look like? I mean, most plans don't look like this, by the way, because getting rid of fossil fuels is usually not part of getting rid of them directly is not part of a plan. What is part of a plan is subsidizing renewables in the hope that would lead to reductions in fossil fuels. And as we've seen so far, that hasn't been the case. All of the new renewables go to supply new energy demand rather than getting rid of old fossil fuel supply. Anyway, so this plan is broken down into 5 sections. The first one is phasing out fossil fuels, doing some really obvious things. Like step 1, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. That's the first rule of holes. And so that means banning all new fossil fuel infrastructure starting now. This is something that the International Energy Agency, a rather conservative group, said several years ago that in order to meet climate targets, we must stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure starting right now. And that was a few years ago. So that's step 1. The second thing is like, if you don't want something, you should stop subsidizing it. Stop all fossil fuel subsidies. There were reports that last year, the direct subsidies for fossil fuels around the world were $1 trillion, and the indirect subsidies were about $6 trillion. So that's a crazy amount of money. And we're paying that money in order to destroy the climate. So you would think that, kind of logically speaking, we should stop doing that. As Jim Hansen emphasized, and something I've worked with him on, we should implement a carbon fee and dividend carbon pricing policy. That means putting a rising price on the carbon content of fossil fuels and charging that tax or fee right where it comes out of the ground. So the well or the mine, or if it's imported, the port of entry. And then you take 100% of all the money collected and give it back to every legal resident on an equal basis. And when you do that, you find out that about the bottom 70% of households make more money on the dividend that they pay in higher prices due to the fee. So that means people will like it and want the price to go rather high. And it is the price going rather high, which is what makes it effective. So the fossil fuel industry would love a $50 a ton carbon tax. They're all in for that. They've already built it into all their economic models. But they don't want a $100 tax. They don't want a $150 tax. They don't want a $200 a ton tax. They certainly don't want that. So, but a fee and dividend system would start maybe at $30, $40 a ton, but then go up $10 a ton every year. So then in a year, you're at $130. In a decade, you're $130. And then beyond that, you're at $200. And the important thing is that everybody knows exactly what the fee is going to be in the future. So even though it might not start off very high, it will immediately stop all new fossil fuel infrastructure, because any infrastructure is going to be around for 20, 30, 40 years, and they know the carbon tax will be enormous in 15 or 20 years. So the economics won't work out to build a new plant. So it'd be a very effective way to go. Now, those things would, all those are fairly direct in reducing fossil fuels, banning new infrastructure, stopping subsidies, putting a tax. Those are very effective. But I think on top of that, we should also just phase it out. Like when we found out that asbestos gives you, and insulation and paint and all this stuff gives you cancer, we didn't like put a tax on asbestos. We just banned it. And it was very effective and stopped it very quickly. And we can do the same. We can do the same for banning fossil fuel cars. By 2030, they're probably going to be, no one's going to buy them anyway by that time, because they'll be far more expensive than electric cars by that time. Phase out production of fossil fuel electricity by 2035. That's something we can do because we'll actually save trillions of dollars a year if we do that, because fossil fuel energy from, electricity from renewables is cheaper than from fossil fuels. And then the harder one is getting rid of all fossil fuel energy by 2040. That's things like cement and steel and other high heat applications. And fossil fuels are so embedded all over the world, but we have to try. And then some other things we do is require all new buildings to be all electric, not to have any natural gas hookups. Fossil fuel industry is fighting this. There are some places like Berkeley that pass this, and other places, but they're really against. If you're a gas company, imagine what that looks like to you. And so they're really fighting that. An easy thing to do, and we are starting to do this, is to monitor and fix all methane natural gas leaks. I mean, that wastes money, and it's a relatively easy thing to do. And then that would have a big effect, because a big problem with natural gas is what's called fugitive emissions, leaks and things like that along the way from the well where you get it from, the pipelines, the compressor stations, and maybe in the factories where it's used. And when it leaks, methane is 120 times more powerful than CO2 while it's in the atmosphere. It doesn't last a long time. It only lasts 10 to 20 years. And that's why you hear a number like 30 times more powerful than CO2 over a 100-year period. But while it's in the atmosphere, it's 120 times more powerful. And that's what we're experiencing right now. And that's what we have to worry about right now, because we have to address climate change in the next 20 years. And then also require all companies to disclose their direct and indirect emissions, because it's really hard to control something unless you're measuring it. And that's the whole section on phasing out fossil fuels. All those things are actually rather simple to write down, and they're actually, in some sense, simple to implement, except for the fact that you would have tremendous pushback against doing any of those things by the fossil fuel industry and by people worried about the price of gas or these kinds of things, because people are far more worried about short-term economic interests than they are about their long-term survival. Then just continuing on this, Eric, okay, yeah, Eric, go ahead. Let's see.
One thing I love about the carbon fee and dividend is the predictability, right? That people would really know, gasoline will not be cheaper than X on date Y. It might be more expensive, but it can't be less expensive, right? So that I think that the predictability is like a huge benefit. Are there other ways God forbid, assume we never have carbon fee and dividend. Are there other ways to drive this predictably higher prices without something as clever as carbon fee and dividend?
Yeah. So there's two, and in the paper that Jim Hansen and I wrote that we submitted to Congress on this subject, we talk about that. So you're right. Very key advantage to fee and dividend is the fact that you know what it's going to be in the future. You know exactly what it's going to be. Actually, it could be higher because usually it's listed as $10 a ton more every year, unless we're missing climate targets, and then it bumps up to $15 a ton more per year. But it's at least $10 a ton. And then you can write that different ways. So there's two pieces to it. One is how you set the fee. And you could set the fee, and this is sort of a priori, like you choose ahead of time. This is what it is, going to start at $30, going to go up $10 every year, right? Well, you could, so that's how you set the fee. What you do with the money that's collected is a separate issue. So in fee and dividend, the fee is set. It doesn't vary year to year based on auctions, which is the other way to do it. When you hear cap and trade, when you hear that one, that's the main way we do it now. And that's what the European system is based on. And that is they set, this is how much emissions we're going to allow, and we're going to have you bid on the right to emit a ton of CO2. That sounds like a great idea, theoretically very efficient from an economics point of view, but it's a horrible and terrible way to do it for the reason you just mentioned, because it will vary a lot. And in a recession, it's going to drop like a rock because emissions will be down anyway, and the price will collapse. And this is exactly what happened, by the way, in the European system. It crashed like to $5 a ton. Now it's up. Now they made lots of changes to make it much more like fee and dividend. They never made it fee and dividend, but they put a floor so you couldn't drop below a certain price and that kind of thing. And so now price is way up there. But it's a terrible system not to know ahead of time. The power of it, because when you don't know what it is, you're not going to plan based on it. You're not going to say, well, I'm not going to build that factory. You go, oh, it might be $5. Yeah. But if you know exactly what it is, you can factor that in. It's so important. The next part, though, is what do you do with the money? And very often what they do is the government just takes the money and hey, we're going to spend this on clean energy projects and everything like that. That's also a terrible thing to do because a carbon tax is on its own, if you don't give the money back to the public, is an extremely regressive tax. It taxes the poor the most from a percentage of their income. Why is that? Well, because if you're poor, you spend a lot of money on heating your house, and that's a big part of your budget. You have to maybe you have a car, you got to buy gas for it, or you take public transportation that uses gas. And so it's not that the absolute amount, you're spending a tiny amount compared to what a wealthy person spends. But as a percentage of your income, it's a very large part. And now all of a sudden there's a tax on it, which raises the cost of everything that you buy. So that normally would be a very bad thing from a social justice point of view, to put a tax on, just a straight tax on carbon where all the money goes to the government. However, if you turn that around and give 100% of the money back to the public, now you've taken something that's regressive. Regressive tax is a tax that hurts the poor the most. Now you've made it anti-regressive. Now you have a policy that helps the poor the most because everybody gets the same amount every month. But for the poor, that's a much higher percentage of their wealth than it is for a wealthy person. A wealthy person, okay, a little bit more, that's great. But a wealthy person, it would almost be like a universal basic income in a sort of a small form. And again, we said, while it's a high percentage comes from fossil fuels of their spending, it's still a small amount compared to a wealthy person. So this payment they get is far more than the extra they spend to cover the increased fee. And that's why a U.S. Treasury Department study showed that 70% of people will make money. The bottom 70% of households will make more money on the dividend than they pay in higher prices. So that's good.
I was asking though, if God forbid this never happens, what other approaches can have a consistently, predictably higher fossil fuel prices over time? I mean, obviously, I love this way of doing it, but God forbid it doesn't happen. What else can give us that trend line so that it will be, you know, incompetence for someone doing an economic analysis of a project not to know, not to factor in, fossil fuel prices are going to be going up. Any other options that
Well,
are worth
again,
talking about at all?
any scheme that has a fixed or increasing fee, it's just not rather than an auction fee. So any of those schemes, but again, though they will be regressive and they'll hurt the poor. And the other problem you have, by the way, is if you're just making all products more expensive, the public will hate it, and therefore they won't support it. This is what happened when France tried to put an extra gas tax, and the yellow vests protested in the streets. If this was fee and dividend, the yellow vests would be celebrating in the streets because this would be something that would be helping the poor, not hurting the poor. So again, you got to separate out how you set the fee. And yes, you can have plans that set the fee with a priori, or you know, pick ahead of time. It's going to go up this much every year. Period. End of story. That's great. That's step one. But step two is, what do you do with the money? And again, the reason you give the money back, it's kind of a little funny. It's not really, I mean, it sounds like it's to be social justice, and it's true. It does. It is part of social justice to do that. But the real reason you're doing it is so that the public accepts having a very high fee. It is the high fee that does the work. So a $50 a ton fee, okay, it's nice and everything, but it's going to have very little effect. $200 a ton fee is going to have a huge impact, because after a while, by the way, the cost of removing CO2 will be less than the fee. And since you get a credit for not emitting, or if you emit and then you put it back underground, that's also zero. If it's cheaper to put the stuff back underground than it is to pay the tax, all of a sudden, when you cross that threshold, emissions just drop like crazy, because everyone's going to say, I don't want to pay a $200 tax when I can pay $150 to get rid of it. Right? It's like paying, if you had to pay, I don't know, like pay a tax on garbage you left in the street. And all of a sudden it was cheaper to hire a garbage man to come by and pick it up and throw it away than paying the tax. You know,
is there something, oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
Is there something built in for special cases? Like, imagine I'm a farmer and I've recently acquired combines and harvesters and tractors and whatever that are all fossil fuel based. And so while I'm not a wealthy person flying around on a jet plane, I am using way more fossil fuel than a normal person. Anything built in to help that person not get killed by
you can, and there have been, so this bill for this fee and dividend has been proposed in Congress multiple times. It's never passed, but it's been submitted many times. One of them I remember from several years ago had something like that in it, where rural states paid less than more urban states because they were trying to cover the fact that they have to drive longer. It's a rural thing. I don't think that's a good idea. And the other one you could do is also exempt the military from it. But again, I don't think it's a good idea. You want, first of all, the military is like the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world. The U.S. military is like the #1 user of oil in the world. And you want them to have the same incentives to go to electric tractors and do, you know, whatever else, electric combines. And you want that, right? So yes, you can do that for political expediency, but the more you do of that, and also one of the big benefits of fee and dividend is that it is so simple. And in fact, as I mentioned, I think on the Hansen interview, the #1 objection I get when I give a talk on fee and dividend is that people don't believe the government will implement what I just described. It sounds too good, right? The government will take all the money. No, no, no. In fact, you'll be able to tell because you know the total collected and you know your check, and you can check with your friend to see if they got the same check. Everybody gets exactly the same check, and you know how many checks were issued. You multiply the two, that should be the total collected. Like there's no room to cheat, which is another big thing, by the way. Another big advantage of the system is there's no middlemen, there's no people doing markups, there's no people when you have let's say we're going to take all the money collected and use it to implement renewable energy. Well, you can just imagine the lobbying going on to get that money focused in my state or for my little cute little thing, whatever it might be, just everybody. And then you can imagine later on, we're going to find out that a lot of the money didn't really go to lowering emissions at all. It just went to some pet project or some scam. There's none of that in this. There's no ability to scam it. It's so simple. It's totally transparent. And that's why people don't believe it. They can't believe a government policy could be so transparent and so not prone to lobbyists and things like that.
Well, of course, most people don't know this idea exists.
That's correct.
I think the biggest problem is complete unfamiliarity. Maybe the second biggest is that fossil fuel companies are allowed to make campaign contributions. So between those two, a lack of knowledge and the power of fossil fuel would love to shift both of those.
Well, I will say, speaking of that if you like this idea and want to support it, you can join citizensclimatelobby.org, Citizens Climate Lobby. And one of the main they do is focus on trying to get fee and dividend passed. However, be a little careful because there's another group, which I'm forgetting the name, which sounds very similar. Wow, it's been so long since I looked at it. It's another group pushing fee and dividend. It looks exactly the same, except you'll see that on its website, it's supported by ExxonMobil and Chevron and Shell, and all the oil companies support this. And I love to say that all the oil companies support my fee and dividend idea, which is a true statement. However, when you look at how they want to implement it versus Citizens Climate Lobby, remember I said it goes up $10 a year. So in this other group, which I'm just totally blanking on the name right now, sorry. They start the fee higher. They start at $40, and back in the day, it was $10 a ton for since Climate Lobby starting point. I think it should be higher now, but let's say $10. And then this other group said starting at 40. Wow, that's even higher. That's incredible. But then you look at how much they want it to go up every year, and they only want it to go up at like the cost of living. They don't want this big $10 per year chunk that gets you $100 more in a decade. They never want it to go above $50. So they start at 40, go up the cost of living, and figure, 10, 15 years, it'll be $50 or $52, and they don't care about that. That's totally fine with them. And that way they're trying to disable the real fee and dividend policy that they really don't like. So they actually have this other system that they're proposing, and they got all these, lots of people to sign up for it, and they're much slicker. And, and this was George Shultz started this, and Jim Baker. And George Shultz, I spoke to him about fee and dividend once. He said, well, I invented that, which I thought was a good idea that he thinks that. I don't think he did, but still. So anyway, so be forewarned that when you're doing fee and dividend, it's really important to have a fee that goes up a significant amount every year. That's a key attribute that we need. Good. So Bev, you want to try again? I see your thing is saying something like you're talking, but oh, you go. I think I can hear you. Go ahead. Bev?
My mouth is full.
Oh, I see. All right.
I'm eating breakfast.
But it's working. Your mic's working at least, so we've gotten that far. Well, Well, let's see. I'll get back to this climate plan since that's kind of important. When we say, are we going to do anything or not, right? That's what these two articles are about. Well, we're not really doing anything. And the other one, oh, yes, we can do so much. I think my plan is a serious plan of once you decide, do you want to succeed on climate action rather than choosing to fail like we have in the past? What does choosing to succeed look like? And I think this is what choosing to succeed looks like. So we talked about getting rid of fossil fuels. And then we do want to expand clean energy, but I don't think we have to spend government money much on it, except for the R&D side. And I say increase that by 10 to 100x what we're spending now. That still doesn't end up being very much money because we're not spending much now. And then the big thing is to simplify permitting and updating the grid, because there is it's incredible the amount of renewable energy projects that would be hooked up to the grid tomorrow if they could be, if the grid would allow them to be. So we have to simplify the permitting of clean energy projects and upgrade the grid so that we allow all the projects that want to add to the grid to add to the grid. And that's actually some kind of crazy that we're not doing that already. I mean, that's something that's a no-brainer. We have to address biodiversity loss because climate is not the only thing that's going to get us. In fact, I saw a tweet today about these like 10 birds that went extinct in 2023. And that's happening, all species. It's just very bad. And so one thing we could do tomorrow, we now have technology, satellite technology, that can take a picture of every spot on Earth every single day. And we can use that to ban deforestation because we can see when the deforestation even starts with the first road starting to go in to the forest. And we can detect that. You can use AI to monitor all the pictures and see where it's happening. And then you can use police or the army or military to enforce this. So this is simply a question of political will. The technology is there now, which wasn't really there before, where we could actually basically ban deforestation. We have to, the problem of cows and meat, and every pound of beef creates 60 pounds of CO2. Lamb is number 2 at 24, and then you have coffee and chocolate. A chicken, for reference, is 6 pounds of CO2 for every pound of meat, so 10 times better than beef. And so there's lots of things we can do, but we should have just like we have fee and dividend for fossil fuel emissions, we should have sort of a fee and dividend system for the emissions from agriculture and especially from meat production. And a third of all the non-ice covered land on Earth is used for meat production. So it could have a huge impact if trees grew on those things that could help absorb CO2, give us a little buffer to fight climate change. Since we're such a destructive species, I said we have to put aside 50% of all lands and oceans for nature. Other people are calling for this. I spoke to Sylvia Earle, an oceanographer, about this, and she said we need to put 100% of the oceans aside for nature right now. I said, but you mean no fishing at all? She says, no fishing at all. She said, because if we don't do that right now, there won't be any fish to fish later. So, that's the situation we're in. So that's the biodiversity loss. The next step, reduce atmospheric CO2 and cool the Earth. Stuff we talk a lot about on Climate Chat, but in this case, we're just talking about carbon capture to pull CO2 out of the air. We're also talking about sunlight reflection methods. I actually have to update this plan to replace the word solar radiation management with sunlight reflection methods. And then social and economic justice programs, clean energy support for the global south so that they can improve living standards without relying on fossil fuels, fund adaptation research and development because we're going to need it, and because climate change is coming, it's going to be much worse than it is now, and we're not ready for it. Promote education for women and provide family planning services. That lowers population and the right way, as opposed to implementing draconian measures. And then require energy use reduction among the top 10% of emitters, because that's 50% of all emissions. And those are the people that can actually tolerate a reduction in energy use without suffering at all. And of course, they're the ones in charge of setting all these policies. So that's going to be a hard one to do. So anyway, any thoughts or comments on that plan among anybody? We have some new people here. All you have to do is raise your hand. If I'm not sure how this is working on Zoom, whether you can unmute on your own without me asking you to unmute. But see, I'm going to just, so some people have to be.
I think we have to unmute them.
No, I there's an ask to unmute, so I did that.
Okay.
I think once we do that, then
I can unmute anytime I want.
because I did that for you already. Because when you first came on, I did ask to unmute. So I think I saw half the room was set for one and the other half was not set for that. Anyway, so let's see. We have some more people coming in. Hey, Stacy.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Do you have any? Let's see. I'm going to check out the comments here.
I you know, as well, my two comments are always add in bike infrastructure in there because people riding bikes, that's the overlooked alternative to burning fossil fuels is at least for transportation purposes on a local basis. It's very helpful. And how what would it take to get somebody to actually say, yeah, this is what we should be doing, because it's a great plan. And like you said, it's all just common sense. Just think about it. What do we need to do to get out of the problem that we've created? And here's a whole list.
Yeah, but the problem really isn't the list. The problem is having the will to do something. I mean, we really haven't chosen yet to do anything. President Biden did pass the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of subsidies for renewable energy. It also did have some funding for carbon capture, which is, we have to reduce our emissions. We have to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have to cool the earth temporarily while we do the first two. But one of the main things we have to do is reduce fossil fuel emissions. It's really obvious. And that's why you're doing the renewable energy, right? But so while he did that, he also then approved several new big fossil fuel infrastructure projects, which you just can't do. Right. It's just not allowed if you are serious about fighting climate change. And yet he did that. So it's, we're not really in the mode yet where we've decided to do something about it. Now, Jim Hansen, when we were interviewing him, said, what we have to do, since the problem is money in politics, and therefore step one is to get money out of politics. Well, I agree that money in politics is a huge problem. If that's going to be step one, I think we're all pretty much screwed. However, I was thinking about this. I'm going to get back to Jim on this too. What would get us to be in a mindset to get rid of money in politics, right? What would do that? I think one thing that would do that is the understanding that we're headed for catastrophe because of climate change. And then the way we need to fight it is to get rid of money in politics. So it's sort of a two-step, right? Just on its own, there's money in politics, so they control politics. They're not going to agree to get rid of money in politics, and they're the ones who run politics. So you need this uprising, you need a public uprising to fight against it. But what does that? There has to be a dissatisfaction with something. The economy is running well, and right now things, GDP is growing and all this kind of stuff, which is actually hurting climate, by the way. But from a public, personal point of view, it seems pretty good. You're not going to get an uprising. But what could get an uprising is the understanding and the fear of climate change getting even worse than it is. And we're going to get a little taste of that next year, 2024, what that looks like. And that's just a taste, by the way. It won't be what it's going to look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now. It could be really mind-blowing, right? But if you can get people to focus on that and believe that, and then enough that you could get them to change the political system, well, then, if that's true, you could also get the political system as it exists to pass the rules I just gave you. In other words, if you're going to change the entire political system because of people's fear of climate change, get them to fear climate change and get them to implement climate policies right away. Well, yeah, you can still go and change the political system. That's great.
I agree, but the revolution will not be televised. The problem is that everything is based upon consumption. Our whole economy, our whole way of life, our ever increasing investment portfolios and et cetera. It's all all the media that we consume is based on advertising and consumption. And so the message won't get out that this is what we need to do. And so there won't be any uprising because we have this. I can just do this all the time. We distract ourselves with television, with media, with social media. I mean, and all of those are wired for their own self-preservation. Traditional media, certainly. That's why we hadn't heard about climate change for so long. They are allergic to talking about it because their biggest advertisers are the biggest polluters. So why would you want to do something that will annoy the people that are feeding you? And it is a never-ending cycle with media, with our politicians. They are all in this system of buy, consume, etc. And so anything to the contrary will not make it out. And we will be forced into our best attempts at adaptation. And that it's all fine. Our entire world is going to be, it's all fine. It's all fine, because while everything is burning around us, because
well, but it won't be. I mean, there will be thresholds. And by the way, these thresholds have been passed in some places. Those places might not have much political ability, like in Africa, and there's towns being flooded. There was a place in, is it Italy, or was that incredibly flooded? I mean, in the last 2023 was an amazing year for individual climate impacts that if you were there, you were impacted already. But
yeah, I mean, people and places getting wiped off the map. And sometimes we don't hear about it. And then even when it's happened, we forget. No one holds this with them. Even the people that have gone through it, their cars all got washed away. They go get another one. No one says, hey, let's get a bus instead of this stupid thing.
Yeah.
Because that's the way we're wired.
But I think this is like the crux of it. I do think that we're going to, first of all, be more aware over the next few years of what the future looks like. I mean, the thing like AMOC and things like that, I think if people really understood what that means and that it really could happen in a very short time frame, and in fact, such a short time frame that you must act immediately in order to avoid it, I think that could get some change that we haven't seen yet. And again, I've been doing this for a really long time, almost 20 years. And for the first 15 years, there was no public interest. I mean, yeah, the people who came to hear my talk or something like that were interested in climate, a very small percentage of the population, and most of the population didn't pay any attention. And this is why I'm very surprised when I read something this morning. Maybe it was in that Hannah Ritchie thing, that there's a large percentage of young people that feel that they're going to die from climate change, that their world is doomed and things like that. And to me, this is strange because for 15 years, they're trying to get people to pay attention and no one cared one way or the other, about it. And then all of a sudden in the last 5 years, there's a lot more attention and a lot more concern about the future, which I think is a good thing. You have to be concerned about the future because that can then drive action. And again, I think the only difference between the first 15 years and the last 3 to 5 is climate damage that we've recognized as being from climate. I mean, it happened before too, but it was hard to pin it. But now, you know, there's no explanation except for climate change, right? And so that's getting the world concerned, step one, and now you can act. And I think it's going to get worse. It's obviously going to get worse. So I, in some sense, I see a silver lining to that, in that seems to be the only thing that drives action. So let's see. We have Nadia. Nadia, you're welcome. You have to unmute.
Hello.
Hi.
I think there are several levels of the politics having major problems. I mean, for one, there's the sort of domestic affairs, but there's also a geopolitical bit of problem where I guess the most affected regions are, well, also the most economically and politically disempowered regions, like basically the third world, global south, etc. So,
by the way, it's a little hard to hear you. Can
what?
you speak a little closer to your microphone because it's a little fuzzy.
Oh,
All right. Is that
she
any better?
sounded great to me, but okay.
Okay, but
All right.
get going. Maybe it's just my hearing is not
You're
that
fine.
good.
Go, Nadia. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. But I guess there's possibly good news there in that the whole de-dollarization BRICS effort is kind of in a gigantic rebellion against the West, global North, whatever. So in some respects, that sort of defeat of the bloc that we ourselves are in could be a promising sign with respect to doing something about the environment.
Are you involved in any of these particular groups that are protesting or anything like that?
No. That's kind of not really. I don't really think it's very productive because basically, the secret police, like FBI, COINTELPRO, etc., will just annihilate you. So it's not really a good idea to do that.
Well, it's being effective in some parts of the world, like in England. I mean, they are making it illegal to protest, which is pretty funny coming from a place like that. But it's also growing, and people don't like it. They think it's disruptive, and why are you blocking the roads? I'm trying to get to work. But it turns out that those kinds of things actually are effective. And we'll be talking about this, I should say, on January 14th, in 2 weeks from now, with our guest, Johanna Volhart. And I should also say, since we're in the middle here, that next week is Peter Diblitson, who wrote the paper on the AMOC collapse, on how that could actually happen quite soon. So those are two upcoming the next 2 rooms here on Climate Chat, 2 that you don't want to miss. So anyway, with that little plug, and also I guess the plug to subscribe and like the program. Hit that like button, smash that like button. All right, so Nadia, back to what you're saying there.
Yeah, I think I pretty much summed it up in that I think it's not going to come from the West/us. It will come when, in effect, we are defeated by the global South, etc., rising up. And unfortunately, by that point, it may already be past a number of tipping points.
Yeah, I don't see that as happening. I mean, I don't see that as being an effective way to fight climate change. By the way, you can always argue that we're not going to continue burning fossil fuels forever, because if we just continue on the path we're on and try to, well, then we collapse into a Mad Max kind of world where, society has collapsed, and therefore you're not burning fossil fuels very much because everything has fallen apart and lots of people have died and things are very, very rough for everyone. So in that, I mean, I think we should try to avoid that scenario, but that's our choice so far. By the way, all this is in our hands. All of this is a choice we're making. And so far, the choice we're making is the worst possible choice there is. And that is to muddle, as Kevin Anderson said, to muddle along for a few more years while we lock in enormous changes from climate change. And I think that's not a good idea. So I'm not disagreeing with you necessarily. It's certainly possible that we'll continue to try to do what we're doing, which we won't maintain the status quo, and that's not one of the options available. And if we do that, then the crisis in the rest of the world will create lots of, people rising up and trying to fight it. But I don't think that's going to end well if that's what it comes down to.
Well, Mad Max might not be the best parallel to use.
What would
the
you
premise
use?
of that was, well, its premise was that in effect, peak oil or exhaustion or decline of oil would precipitate a nuclear war. So that's.
Well, I didn't mean it in that sense.
Yeah.
I just meant in the fact that you're on your own. A government has collapsed, right? And that's happening. That's what we saw it in Somalia. It's not like something you can't imagine, right? We've seen it in other places, and it is predicted to actually happen much sooner than people think. Because when you have so many crises, let's say you don't have enough food for everyone because of climate change, let's say some really bad things happen there. It's really hard to maintain your government when people are starving. They're not going to accept whatever you say. So anyway, but that's a very useful comment. I think we have other, by the way, I'm getting feedback now. Why am I getting feedback all of a sudden? Maybe Daisy. Daisy, you have something to say?
I was going to say something about Mad Max.
Go ahead.
I like what Nadia said, that it was on nuclear war, but if you look at so climate change, the way I like to look at it, in one of the experiments I like to compare it to, and when you said Mad Max, it reminded me of it. The Universe 25 experiment is basically when you take an organism, separate it from nature, it becomes apocalyptic. And in this case, the organisms were mice or rats. And over decades, I don't know if you guys have heard of this experiment, but they become apocalyptic. So it's kind of like Mad Max. Like, I know it was, I don't know, a nuclear war or whatever, but that's basically where we're headed, because when we're separated from nature, we become increasingly violent. And then towards the end of these experiments, infantile goes up to 99%, all the babies get killed. And then they have these groups of males that either get very extrovert and violent or very introvert, and then they're called the beautiful ones, because all they do is groom and they're not interested in mating. And we already see that right now today in parts of Asia. If you Google the term grass eating men, we now see the two swings where people get either very introverted and they have no interest in mating, or very extroverted, and then we see in the animals they don't honor the mating cues and they just go into the burrows of the female. Where when we're connected to nature, and climate change is not only about saving our planet so we have a planet to live on, but it's also having to deal with our mental health, because when we are separated from nature, there is now a psychosocial, spiritual argument that we are wired to be connected to nature or we self-destruct. So the Mad Max scenario is actually very real, because as long as we're separated from nature, just killing each other. And most certainly, I think that we're with North Korea and Russia and everything, it's people with people's needs and more scarcity and more desperation. I think that we are on our way to what you're saying. And another pathway, if it's okay if I continue my share for a couple more sentences.
Yeah, go ahead.
I believe that the way out of it is fellowship. And if you want me to speak more to fellowships, those are just systems that honor willingness and capacity, and they're about collaboration and relationship that comes intrinsically from attending to needs, instead of merit-based systems that objectify everyone into measuring people based off productivity and then paying them based off of their work.
Okay. I think that climate also is going to trigger, well, has already and will trigger social disruption. We've seen it already. There was a 5-year drought in Syria which triggered the Syrian crisis. And there was a lot of fighting going on, but that was, farmers walking off their land because they couldn't grow anything. They again went to the cities. They were upset, and there was a lot of violence, and therefore a lot of people left Syria. And most of them went to Africa, but like 100,000 went to Europe, and that disrupted Europe's politics a lot. That people were fearful of these people coming in, and they got more right wing. And so we see it even with very minor climate impacts relative to what there could be, by the way. And so when, one thing that climate does is it causes migration, right? Where if you're a place you can't live anymore, you have to move. And places that have enough resources don't want more people coming. And this is just, putting fuel on the fire, I guess. So I think we're going to see, even without the study, which I haven't seen, and maybe you could post a link to the study in the chat here. But even without that, just the fact that climate change is going to put more pressure on society is going to make it a trickier situation to deal with. So, I mean, on one hand, the pressure will maybe help cause change and a desire to succeed on climate action, as opposed to so far choosing to fail. But you also get to the situation, you could get to the situation where things are falling apart because of climate change. And even if there's kind of some will to do something, you start to lose your ability to act as an integrated nation or an integrated world and that kind of thing. So those are the things we have to watch out for. And that's also why we have to act right away and not wait. Oh, Eric, you have your hand raised.
In terms of this Mad Max point, is there anybody you trust who models like what states will fail and about when these things should happen, or things like the disaster scenarios that are fairly predictable? Anybody who thinks about those kinds of things? I've read something about mass migrations, but I haven't read about the rest of it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I wrote about this recently. There's a group called the Fund for Peace, and they put out what they used to call the Failed States Index, which was like a global map color-coded. And if you were red, you were like Somalia, your state had failed. And then you could be like, I don't know, different shades of orange and yellow and green and blue, whatever. And I gave a climate talk to them, and this is at least 10 years ago. It was a long time ago. I went to Washington and I gave them this climate talk, and I was amazed that the Failed States Index does not take climate change into account for its decision making about what a potential fail. I'm saying, like, the thing that will cause all states to fail eventually is not even a factor. And I thought about this, I don't know, like a month ago or something, and I decided to look them up again. And they, first of all, changed the name from the Failed States Index to the Fragile States Index, because everyone hated being on the Failed States Index. And even if you weren't failed yet, if you were on the way to failing, you had a yellow or something, everyone was like freaking out. All the countries were freaking out, and they were lobbying them to change it. So they had like this problem they had to deal with. So they dealt with it by just changing the word from failed to fragile. So that's number one. But then I also look back at their methodology again, and they still aren't taking climate change into effect, which,
well, are they trying to
I don't
predict
even
the
understand
future, or are
that.
they
I
trying
mean,
to
how
just,
could you
are they
even
trying
think
to,
that way?
are they trying to predict the future? Or are they just telling the current state of, do you have law and order in your area?
Well, that's a good question, and it's probably a very nuanced answer. But I think the whole point of the thing is to be a sort of a warning about the future, right? I mean, it's describing the present, but the whole purpose of it is to say, oh, hey, be careful. This country is in trouble. They're yellow on their way to red, something like that. So, but even if you only did today, Let's look at Syria. Syria became a failed state back then because of climate change. And climate change is not one of the criteria they're looking at. So, I mean, and I was amazed back then when I gave the talk. I said, how's it possible? But, you know, back then it was long enough ago that you could say, well, you know, we haven't really studied climate change. It's not, you know, that's something that you guys are doing or something. You know, there were a lot of people not focused on climate. I don't see how you can possibly do that today. I mean, it just boggles my mind. Anyway, you can look it up. Fund for Peace is the name of the organization. It's a nonprofit organization, whatever, I believe. And it's called the Fragile States Index.
But in terms of who is actually doing an analysis of, you know, like who feeds data into insurance companies and stuff about, okay, so, you know, fire problems in this part of California are going to be so bad that, you know, even the government won't be able to afford to rebuild things. And I mean, who's doing
Well,
kind of
the insurance
the
companies are doing
failure?
that, and that's why they're pulling out of California and Florida. I mean, the ones who their money, their income depends on getting this right. It doesn't help for them to be Democratic or Republican. You know, it's like they're either going to lose all their money or they're not, right? I mean, so if you look at insurance companies, they take climate change very seriously, and they have started pulling out of certain kinds of insurance in Florida and California. In California because of fire, and in Florida because of hurricanes and flooding and all that kind of stuff. So that's happening. And speaking of failed states, if you take a literal state, I think whatever hurricane was the last big hurricane in Florida, the total damage was like $100 billion. And a lot of that was covered by private insurance, some was uninsured, and then the state has a backup, you know, insurance group for people who can't get insurance and had to pay some money. But if let's just say it all went to the state only, that loss would have been equal to the entire budget of the state of Florida for the year. So in other words, if we get to this, no one is insuring and Florida has to do all of it, and then there's a big hurricane that could literally wipe out the entire budget of Florida, right? We're at that point where that's a scenario that could play out. So let's see. Wait, anybody else here on stage who haven't spoken yet? Michael just joined. M. Jerome, if you want to say anything, either just raise your hand or unmic at this point, because we're going on to 11:23. I'd like to keep these rooms a little shorter. I kind of think they'll get better replay on YouTube in the future as we do that, especially kind of the interviews and things, because we do much longer interviews than most people do, but even an hour would be on the high side, I think, compared to what most people do. They do these like 20-minute things. But I like getting into the details, and we're going to have a really interesting discussion next week with Peter about the AMOC collapse. And again, this is it's amazing that it's not getting the coverage it's getting, because this is something that if they are right, and I have no reason to think they're not right, because Jim Hansen also says they're the same thing, it affects everyone's, you know, if you're really old, maybe but it affects your children. I mean, we're talking about like 2040s, 2050, for all of a sudden the world being a totally different place in terms of climate. And it's not that it's warmer. In fact, in Northern Europe, it's going to be colder, but it's going to get warmer in the southern, like in the Southern Ocean where Antarctica is located. It's going to have incredible impacts in terms of agriculture productivity, storms larger than we've ever seen, an almost immediate couple feet of sea level rise along the US East Coast, and eventual 10 feet plus by the end of the century or shortly thereafter, on and on. And the fact that this isn't even discussed is, I don't know, it's kind
Well,
of
so
mind-boggling.
it's funny you mention this, because someone on YouTube had recommended, I think, or on Twitter, I can't remember, that I watch this, because I said, is there anyone that's been keeping track of where we went wrong, when we could have done something about climate, et cetera. We had, it's Carl Sagan, then Hansen, testifying in front of Congress, other points in time when it's like, yeah, we kind of knew what we needed to do. And they recommended, I want to say his name is like Stephen Clark or something like that. He's a climate scientist, and he puts the videos are really good. So I subscribed to his channel. And then he put out a year-end recap video. And he basically says, and it's like, so here's this guy who's been like Hannah Ritchie, someone that I really respect. And they put together information in a very coherent way. And then they look at Hansen and say, oh, no, that nobody really thinks that's going to happen. Yet when you rewind back, 5 years ago or whenever it had been some anniversary of him testifying in front of Congress, all of these type of people were saying how right he was, how astounding it was that he got it right. The models, the compute, everything was so unsophisticated compared to today. And yet here's where we are. And so now those same people look at what he's saying and are like, oh, that's not going to happen. Same thing with the Danish couple that you're going to have on about the AMOC shutting down. Oh, that's not going to happen. Nobody really thinks that's going to happen. And it's like, why do you think it wouldn't happen? It's inconvenient.
Well, the other side of it is,
sure,
it's
but
not
they
just, it's
don't
not
think
good
it's gonna
enough.
happen.
It's not good enough to say it's not going to happen. You actually have to provide proof that it's
That
not
it
going to
won't.
happen. And
Yeah.
this is why the space shuttle blew up, the Challenger blew up, is because they said, can you prove it's going to blow up? Well, of course not. You can't prove it's going to blow up. But the data says it's going to blow up, is what the engineers said, but you can't prove it. So they launched. I mean, it's insane in hindsight to think about it, but they launched because he couldn't prove it would blow up. But that's not the right question. The question is, can you prove it won't blow up? That's what you have to ask. And you don't launch if the answer isn't, well, we can't prove it, of course, but we're 99.99% chance it's going to be totally safe. We checked everything. Everything is good. There aren't any glaring issues, that are blinking danger, right? And it was human cognition of asking the wrong question. So, by the way, there wasn't anything wrong with the Challenger. I mean, yeah, there were some things that weren't great about it. It wasn't designed to launch at the temperature they were launching it. And I just say, it's like if you drove your car on a lake and you complained that it didn't work very well because it was underwater, and why didn't it, why isn't it working? Well, it's not designed to drive on lakes. It's designed to drive on roads. And space shuttles are designed to launch at 40 degrees or warmer, not at 28 degrees. And so if it blows up, it's not because the thing didn't work. It's because you launched it at a temperature it wasn't supposed to launch at. And so we're doing the same thing with climate change. We're saying, hey, Jim and Peter, can you prove that the AMOC is going to shut down in 2050? Well, if you can't prove it, we're just going to keep going along as if it's not going to happen. I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, if I just imagine, I mean, there's so many examples you could use with your children. Like you can have them walk blindfolded across a freeway and you won't be able to prove they're going to get hit by a car. Okay, are you going to send them across the freeway blindfolded just because you can't prove it? It doesn't make any sense when you put it in that way, but that's what we're doing. It's not really that much different, actually. It's really kind of the same thing, but our minds are, they're just screwed up. I mean, it's human cognition. I mean, when I put the list of the reasons why we're not fighting climate change, human cognition is the first section, is that we can't think in the future.
Well,
we only think of the present.
And we don't, it's hard. It's like saving. as opposed to spending. It's like, well, what do I get for that? It's like, well, I don't know, something someday, no one, it's not as much fun as the thing now. And I think that's one thing I would like to talk about in another room when we don't have a guest or something, is the whole idea, especially this time of year, and especially Western nations, the amount of travel, the amount of consumption that is associated with this time of year, and what should we be doing about it? Is there a way to do things differently? How can we start shifting without just seeming like enormous party poopers, because the way we are wired, the way our society is set up to do things is enormously destructive. And we really should be more thoughtful about the things that we buy, the travel that we do, etc. We do so much without even thinking about it. And because, well, that's what we've always done. Don't be ridiculous. Why wouldn't you? Blah, 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 blah. But meanwhile, it is, it's the
Well,
problem.
by the way, we'll get back to something else you said, like, was there a turning point that could have happened? And one of the turning points that no one knew about at the time was that Exxon scientists in the 1960s knew about burning fossil fuels would cause it to get warmer. They did models that showed with uncanny precision how much the world would warm. I think they were within 0.1 degree of what it is today. Back in 1960, they predicted this. And they knew and used the word catastrophic. They said continued use of fossil fuels would cause warming that would be catastrophic. And they told the leaders of Exxon this. And at first there was like, oh, we better study that. They were like the leading climate research agency in the world at the time. And it was going on pretty well. And they were maybe going to make a switch. And then I think that the CEOs changed, and the other CEOs said, we're not going to, we follow that we're going to lose money. Let's, instead of saying what's going on and doing the moral thing, of course, if you think your product's going to destroy civilization, even though maybe you make some money from selling it in the short run, that trumps that, and you do something about it. And they could have done something, and that would have been a turning point. Instead, they went the opposite way and went into a disinformation campaign. Even though they knew, they went into a disinformation campaign where they, paid lots of money to politicians and for scientists and things like that, just to mislead and not to prove that burning fossil fuels were safe. They weren't trying to do that. It was the same playbook as the tobacco industry, using exactly the same people that I don't even mean the same kind of people, the same exact people that the tobacco companies hired for their disinformation campaign. The oil companies hired them. And the point was not that it will be bad, it's just that we don't know, right? There's doubt. Yeah. Doubt is our product. That was the famous thing for
my fantasy is the Scarlet Sea, and that there would be a list of these people and that they and their descendants would have to wear this sea of like that they are part of the problem. Everything that they did, because I think that's the only thing that will get some people to change, is to know that your children, everyone you are who has benefited from your wealth that you've created by purveying this doubt, you should not be able to profit from it, and they will have to bear the cost.
Well, we'll see what happens there. Maybe they'll go to jail. Nadia.
It was well before the 70s. The entire reason Exxon got the idea to do that research was from the presentation Edward Teller gave to the American Petroleum Institute at their centennial in 1959. And that in turn was sparked by Susan Revell, I guess debunking the idea that water vapor dominated the greenhouse effect that would otherwise be caused by CO2. That had kind of suppressed the idea through the 1900s up until then. by doing finer grain spectroscopy. And then that caused a big stink. There were even documentaries saying in the late 50s, even before at Edward Teller's presentation, describing this and so on. And of course, before the confusion or whatever about the water vapor, which probably was not actually due to the fossil fuel industry. It was by a guy named Abbott, who I haven't seen what his connections are, but anyway, Svante Arrhenius, who initially quantified the greenhouse effect, anticipated immediately that if fossil fuels went too far, that it would result in human extinction from the planet overheating. But
I can throw in another
problem.
one that you missed is Gilbert
Sorry?
Plass. Gilbert Plass, Plass, who wrote a
Yes.
paper the year I was born called Theory of Climatic Change, where he laid it all out, just kind of like Jim Hansen did in Congress. This was 1956, and it talked about rising sea levels and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, Frank Capra, the film producer director, saw this, and he incorporated this into a segment of the Bell Telephone Science Series TV show.
Yeah,
and
that's
from
yeah.
1958. In 1958, it's like a 2-3 minute segment under the name, if you search for Unchained Goddess on YouTube,
That's it. Yeah.
you will see it. I use it in my TEDx talk, this thing. And so, and by the way, the theory of CO2 was known way earlier. In fact, it was known around 1850s. Didn't know the details of it, but they figured out CO2 was the greenhouse gas. And it was a woman, Eunice Foote, who figured it out.
Yeah.
She didn't get the credit for it until about 10 years ago. And it was thought to be Tyndall, was a more famous scientist who did it a few years later. He got the credit for discovering the CO2 greenhouse effect. But it was Svante Arrhenius in 1896 who wrote the first paper on global warming, where he predicted how much the world would warm if we doubled CO2. And he got it about right, especially, by the way, with Jim Hansen's latest numbers. He got it about right. It was all done by hand, of course, no computers, no models like that. And but he didn't think we would ever double CO2 in for a really long 1,000 years, whatever. But the exponential growth of fossil fuels changed all that. So that was known. And then there was a guy in the 30s, Callender. I can't remember.
Guy
Callender, who, very interesting graph that shows a little temperature going up with a little note that says CO2 effect. It was like the first person to plot the warming, global warming back in the 30s. But I would give a lot of credit to Gilbert Plass, actually, for really doing, in a sense, what Hansen did. He wasn't the guy who figured it all out from the beginning, but he took all the data and he brought it together in a coherent form and presented a coherent story about the big picture, as opposed to one little thing here, one little thing there. And that, so we were really aware in the 50s really what would happen. And it was like this urgent thing, but no one paid attention. I think the first president who was warned about climate change was Lyndon Johnson, so it was something that was known. And again, Exxon really knew much more than everybody else did at the time. They knew it would be catastrophic. I guess Plass maybe did too, but I mean, they had the data, and they had the models, and they just sat on it, and then not only sat on it, but did the opposite and did disinformation as opposed to information. So there were a lot of turning points that could have happened, and we're at one of those right now. We can continue going on saying, boy, climate change is a real problem. I'm really worried about climate change. Should we do anything about it? Let's have a COP session led by a fossil fuel executive. Oh, next one, by the way, is the same thing. Next one's going to be in Azerbaijan, also another fossil fuel place. So, it's weird. We're in a very weird place right now. And the question for the room, the subject of the room, is will we in 2024 get our wits about us and choose to continue to ignore the problem, that, by ignore, I don't mean we don't talk about it. We'll talk about it. We'll worry about it. We'll talk, everything. Oh, look at that happening here. That's all climate. It's climate. But serious action is very straightforward. It's not like this big mystery thing of what we should do. It's very clear what we should do. And yet the political system is set up, and this is what Jim Hanson's saying, that, it's all money is talking here, not logic. And while I agree with him, that's true, I do think that whatever it is that pushes the political system to move away from money in politics, whatever that force is that makes that happen, that same force, if it's a climate force, which I think hopefully it would be, can also get policies to get implemented even before the whole political system changes. Because to me, that's going to take too long. He says it can happen quickly. He gave the example of Ross Perot. What if Ross Perot wasn't crazy, kind of thing? Okay. But again, we also got Trump. I mean, if you bet that way, you can get the opposite effect, right? And that's where we're going to, because the pressure of climate change causes people to rely more on authoritarianism, right? Because they think, we need some strong person to solve these problems. And they'll just say, I can solve anything, whatever, which is what he said. And people believed it. So you got to watch out for that. That's happening around the world, happening in Europe. It happened in Brazil. It's happening, isn't it Argentina right now? Is it Argentina? As the new right-wing person. Italy as a right-wing person. So, this is happening around the world, and we have to really watch out for it and turn the fear of climate, which is a healthy fear, I think, and turn that into action, as we talked about here today. And with that, I think we should probably bring the room to a close, unless someone else has any final thoughts. But I do want to remind you that next week, on January 7th, we'll be interviewing Peter Dividend, who wrote the AMOC paper saying that the AMOC could shut down very soon as, by the way, 2025 was the earliest time, but around mid-century, which would still be unbelievably fast. And it will be very interesting to get it directly from him about how worried we should be. And then on January 14th, we'll have Johanna Volhart, we're going to talk about protest, which came up today here as well. Protest, what's effective in protest, what would be the best climate protests and things like that. So it should be an interesting thing. Now, do you have any final thoughts there?
Oh, some of the right-wing exits are not necessarily from the population really wanting it. It's there's, especially in Latin America, coups and so on, with the CIA involved, etc. Are in there big time.
Well, I would just say that there'll be a lot of political upheaval. It won't all be due to climate change, but it's normally never even thought of as climate change. And take a look through that lens, and I think you'll see that a lot of the pressure for change is going to come from that. Both, maybe in a good sense of people wanting climate action, but in a bad sense when there's just not enough food around and they throw out the government, whoever it was, and then stick somebody else in. So, watch out for that. So with that, please subscribe to the channel, because we had 7,000, 8,000 followers on Clubhouse. Now that we're moving to YouTube, I just got the notice that we passed 500 subscribers on YouTube last week. And so we want to build this up as well as a platform for more in-depth climate discussion, both on not just science only, but on the political side of things, social side of things, psychological side, communications, activism, but also climate science. And next week's going to be a climate science show that I'm really, really looking forward to. So don't miss that. And Happy New Year to everyone. Let's hope that 2024 is a year where we find out that climate action is possible rather than the opposite. So let's hope, and let's all work to make that happen.
How about where we see climate action? Not just think it's possible, but
serious. I mean,
we're
we're gonna see some climate action, but there's a difference between just kind of subsidizing solar panels and phasing out fossil fuels. Those are two different things, and we gotta work on that. So with that, Happy New Year, everyone. And
Happy New Year.
we will see you next week. And it should be a really interesting discussion. Thanks, everyone, for coming.